Hi, here we are with the late Victorian and Edwardian writers. This is a time period which follows the main thrust of the Victorian time, but it comes before World War I. These writers are not an easy fit. They're not completely coherent with one another. But there are certain aspects to the things that some of them are doing that can be found throughout this time period. One of the biggest and most important aspects is the rise of the art for art's sake movement, also called the aesthetic movement. We read Oscar Wilde in his preface to the picture of Dorian Gray. The thrust of this is fairly simple in some ways. In other words, that art should not be a moral teacher. Art should not have the burden of showing us right from wrong. Now, the implications, on the other hand, are very huge, and in fact felt with us in our own time. Do we want our art to tell a story, or do we want our art to teach us? And in this case, Oscar Wilde and others like him argued that trying to prove something to a reader was actually going to hurt the art. We should celebrate beauty, the beauty of the art which is created, and not worry about the morals of characters or dynamics within a painting or a play or a story. This is in part a revolt against the moral earnestness of early Victorian writers. We can think of an obvious example from what we read of Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's not exactly a subtle work, in which it tells us what was good and what was bad. The same activity, by the way, happened on the American side of the pond, if you will. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is a classic example from the 19th century of a work of literature which was written with the intention of teaching a lesson, telling a story, but also teaching a lesson. The late Victorians wanted to remove themselves of that particular burden. You also see attempts at what's called sensationalism, kind of building things up, a lot of shock value. And anti-bourgeois sentiments, a lot of people don't understand that word anymore. Bourgeois really refers to the middle class. And anti-bourgeois sentiments really are coming from the upper class, not the lower class, but from the upper class, especially, again, when we look at a character like Oscar Wilde. I call him a character, he's a real person, but he was quite a character, quote unquote. Edwardians, and we see this particularly with Hardy, but the later writers as well, a certain melancholy or brooding tone. As they got towards the end of the 19th century, many intellectuals, many writers, felt that something was seriously wrong. There's a lot of anticipation of World War I, but it's not just that. It's the decline of religion, it's the rise of capitalism and industry, it's the loss of traditions and values that go with them. And the end of the century, meaning the end of the 19th century, turning towards the 20th century, was actually looked at with a fair amount of fear by a great number of people, including the writers and artists. Thus, the turn of the century is marked less by joy and more by despair. Moving away from the art for art's sake movement, the experience of art is seen as a moral guide. Now, this is a little bit different from what is written in Aurora Leigh. It's more the idea that the experience of the art, that is, the person who is involved with the reading or the art or the music, becomes a better person. As I said already, the rise of influences are already being felt towards World War I. A lot of people saw it coming years before the war actually happened. England itself is at the top of its power, the apex, the high point. And at this top, the traditional approaches to poetry are most popular. Classicism, accessibility, so forth and so on. Now, all this comes to a screeching halt when World War I finally breaks out. We do have Wilfred Owen and his poem Tuque et decorum est, which takes place during World War I. In fact, Owen himself was killed in World War I. But World War I gives birth to modernism.